Welcome to the Brooklyn Book Festival. I am Hafizah Geter. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased from Greenlight Bookstore right outside the plaza. So if you come up and talk to the authors after the panel, I will stop you and make you go outside because other people have to get in. So please let them escape first. Let's see. So I think that's everything we need to know. So to introduce our writers, Novuyo Rosa Tshuma is the author of the novel House of Stone, winner of the 2019 Edward Stanford Travel Writing Award for Fiction with a Sense of Place, shortlisted for the 2019 Orwell Prize for Political Fiction and the 2019 Dylan Thomas Prize, and longlisted for the 2019 Rathbones Folio Prize. In 2017, she received the Rockefeller Foundation's prestigious Bellagio Center Literary Arts Residency Award. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, she is a native of Zimbabwe and has lived in South Africa and the US. She serves on the editorial advisory board and is the editor for the Bare Life Review, a journal of refugee and immigrant literature based in California. Namwali Serpell is a Zambian writer who teaches at the University of California, Berkeley. She received a Rana Jaffe Foundation Writers Award for Women Writers in 2011 and was selected for the Africa 39, a 2014 Hay Festival project to identify the best African writers under 40. She won the 2015 Caine Prize for African Writing. The Old Drift is her first novel. And Marlon James is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Brief History of Seven Killings, The Book of Night Woman, and John Crow's Devil. A Brief History of Seven Killings won the Man Booker Prize, the American Book Award, and the Ansfield Wolf Award for Fiction, and was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award. The Book of Night Woman also won the Minnesota Book Award and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as the NAACP Image Award. A professor at Macalester College in St. Paul, James divides his time between Minnesota and New York. His most recent book, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, is the first of a planned trilogy and was just longlisted for a National Book Award in Fiction. Thank you. So I think to start, I'm going to ask all of our writers to just give a quick synopsis of their books, because I'm assuming not everyone read every book, that you should have. And then they'll read a quick excerpt, and then we'll jump into the conversation and leave time for questions at the end. But I will say this, and there's going to be a man who doesn't listen, but please, questions, not comments, and nothing that starts, this is more of a comment than a question. All right, let's kick it off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Brooklyn. Very excited to be here. House of Stone means Zimbabwe. It's a translation of the country name Zimbabwe, and it's told by this Dostoevskian narrator called Zamani. So Zamani is a very ambiguous character. So his history is ambiguous, his lineage is ambiguous, and he's sort of floating through life. And his mission is to remake his history, in a sense, right? He's rewriting history with the intention of reclaiming his own lineage, creating an identity for himself. And in so doing, he is stealing histories. He's like a siphon, right? He's siphoning histories from a family that he lives with. And as he siphons those histories and rewrites them for his own purposes, we get to learn about the history of Zimbabwe, partially. Various histories about Zimbabwe from the time it was Rhodesia, right through independence in the 80s, right through its tumultuous era in the 80s, when there were massacres in Zimbabwe, an era we don't really talk about at home, right up to the contemporary moment in 2007, the age of Facebook, MacBook, cell phones, and all of that. So that's the scope of the novel. So I'm going to read a brief excerpt. So where I'm going to start reading, here Zamani is talking to his landlord, whom he has perversely appropriated as his surrogate father, and he's been feeding him Johnny Walker, which he fondly calls Johnny. And so he's realized that when he feeds Abednego alcohol, Abednego starts talking, starts parroting, starts chirruping. So here, Abednego has just told him a shameful part about his history, where his father fought for the Rhodesian African Rifles and was patriotic. This is a black African man, and was patriotic to the country of Rhodesia. And Zamani is consoling his surrogate father. So I'm going to start. This is a male character. I have a deep voice. You can pretend I have a deep voice. I put on my best Wittgenstein impression. Our real selves lie buried deep in the stupor of a murky present in which the act of living is ahistorical. And all that matters is breathing, waking now eating, now shitting, now bathing, now walking, and above all, feeling. What the hell is history? Things that didn't belong to anyone and belonged to everyone being claimed by someone, demarcations, lineages, and histories being created abracadabra and made real in the mind, and then consolidated through tales told and then revised to suit not only the mood of the day, but also the vision for the future. Memory aided and abated, yes, by delusion, constantly recreating and justifying, and thus no truth ever mattered except that which was believed to be true. I pause emphatically, as I'm sure Herr Wittgenstein would. So, your father, surrogate father, my beloved surrogate grandfather, carried no shame except that which is common to all of man. How is the value of life to be measured? So he fought on behalf of Rhodesia in the Second World War. So he was part of the Rhodesian African Rifles. So he pledged himself to serve country, to honor and duty demanded by soldierhood. What are honor and duty and country except the trinity of a live, moving hearse in which we throw conquest history-riddled bodies? What do you suppose those soldiers of the Schusterfeld told themselves as they flung in the name of honor and duty and country Jewish bodies, warm and breathing still, into the furnaces at Treblinka? What do you suppose the founders of the US of A were thinking as they wiped out whole Native American populations? And those soldiers of our own Mugabe's 5th Brigade, what do you suppose ran through their minds as they hacked our people to death in Matabeleland during Kukurahundi? I imagine they all saw themselves as ordinary men, just men and even boys who had mothers and lovers waiting somewhere with rose-scented memories bosomed in their chests. At the mention of 5th Brigade and Kukurahundi, my surrogate father begins to convulse. He blinks at me wildly and tries to push me away, squirming at the feel of my hand on his back. I bend over and grab Johnny from the floor and shove it to his lips, feeding him straight from the bottle. I grip him by the neck, but I can feel him trying to push me away, his body struggling away from the sofa, away from me. My grip on his neck tightens, and I pull him close until his head is resting against my chest. I'm pouring Johnny straight into his mouth. He swallows, sputters, begins to cough. I lift the drain bottle from his lips and place it on the floor. I imagine his throat must be burning, and that's why tears are streaming down his eyes and down the sides of his face. Are you trying to say something, Father? His eyes, glistening red with the tiny veins visible in the sclera, are trained on me. There, Father, everything is going to be okay. We sit like that, me cradling him for a long time, until his head lolls on my chest and his body becomes limp. I gently push him back on the sofa until he's sitting slumped against its incline. Father, he groans. Father, can you hear me? His eyes flutter. Do you see me, Father? It's Zamani. Say Zamani. Say Zamani, my son. He groans. No matter. I stare at those closed eyes, imagining their penny you, staring to those teardrop nostrils, at that moist peeping thicket. My father. I sidle up against him, take his hand and place it across my tummy where it rests on my hip limp. Take my Nokia N76 out of my pocket, angle it above us, press my cheek against his, smile into the camera, and snap our selfie. It's going to be all right, Father. Together, we watch the Saturday twilight through the sitting room window, creeping stealthily across the sky. Thank you.
Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for having us. My novel is called The Old Drift, and I started writing it when I was in college, and me and my friends would joke that it was the great Zambian novel that you didn't know you were waiting for. And, you know, faced with the challenge of how do you write a novel about your own country, I decided to start with a graveyard. So The Old Drift is the name of a cemetery by the Victoria Falls in my country. And it is the kind of scattered tombstones of about 17 people. Most of the names are erased or effaced. But these were British settlers who decided to make a camp by the banks of the river and promptly died of malaria because of mosquitoes. So the novel is narrated by a swarm of mosquitoes who come in and describe the history of my country from that point, from the late 19th century, all the way to a near future Zambia. And it does that through the story of 3 families over the course of 3 generations whose lives get caught up in what I call a cycle of unwitting retribution, where each family affects the next in ways that are not entirely discernible to anyone except the swarm of mosquitoes. It spirals down over the course of the century from 3 grandmothers who are told in a magical realist style to 3 mothers told in a social realist style to the children who form a love triangle in the science fictional part of the novel, and that's what moves into the near future. So it's multi-generational, multicultural, multi-genre. And I'm going to read from the very end of the book where a rally that has been organized by these 3 lovers in this love triangle as an attempt at a political protest has gone badly awry. So the only thing you need to know for this passage is that at this point in 2023, people in the world all over have willingly and happily been chipped with they're sort of literal Palm Pilots. Your phones are built into your hands, and they're called beads. And it's a kind of bead in your middle finger that you crook in order to see a screen on your palm. But they can also work as just a flashlight, like a torch. So that's what I mean when I say beads, is these little lights from your hand. Nyla's feet hit the ground just as it began to tremble. For a moment, she thought it was an earthquake, like the one the climate change had brought in 2017. But the vibration was not coming from below. It was blasting from above, surpassing, total. The crowd was immersed in it. Sounds were lost in it. The air was glitching with it. People stopped running and pushing and stood where they were, shocked by its sheer volume. Then their beads shut off, all of them, all at once. Everyone stood in the blaring dark, their hands over their ears, their eyes looking up at the great vibration. Nyla saw the night sky vanish. It was so sudden that she gasped. It was like the stars had fallen to the earth, blossoms shaken off by a mighty wind, or like a great black sack had swept across the sky and caught them up, or like the sky had always been an onyx scroll with white braille letters, and it had just swiftly rolled up tight. Something was up there above them in the sky, moving over the face of the crowd, blocking out the heavens. All around was the swell of that fierce, quivering vibration. A dark immensity lowered. A wheezing grunt, a shriek of hinges, a crash of thunder, more than one crash, 5 or 6 in succession, some near, some far. The earth bucked the crowd off its feet. Nyla landed on a woman nearby who scrambled out from under her and grabbed her son, who had toppled with the impact. The gushing vibration above them abruptly ceased. The thing hovering above them had settled onto the ground, it seemed. The slams had been its feet, hundreds of yards apart. Then there was light. A blinding cone of it blasted down from the darkness above. The light captured the upturned faces of the crowd, their fallen bodies in unwieldy tangles. Human sounds started to come back to life, people calling out to each other, men moaning in their bruising and wounding, babies crying, grandmothers shouting, women saying, "Tulea mwebantu." Car alarms wailed, honked, beeped, accompanied by the smash and tinkle of broken windows. Then a new sound. At first, Nyla thought it was the congregants again, humming their way through the crowd. But this was closer to a ringing, the electric sound of pylons growing steadily unbearable. It looked like smoke was pouring through the air, cutting in and out of the cone of light. People shouted, the mother next to Nyla pointed, her son nodded. "Mulilo," he said, "fire." But there was no burning smell, no searing heat, no flame. The smoke's syrupy sweep through the cone of light reminded Nyla of a starling murmuration. It swung around, its ringing sound drawing near, then far, flooding thick, spiraling wide. Its outer edge swept past her, and she saw tiny buzzing bits within it. Not smoke, drones, micro-drones. She heard the mother say it, udzudzu, mosquitoes. Nyla felt the cumulative touch of them on her face and neck, a whispering feeling, as if a furry wind were passing by. Then she felt the gentle needling. A dozen twinges, 100, 1,000, each no more painful than a normal mosquito bite. The swarm, drones, she was sure of it, had landed upon the crowd and begun to puncture them. In and out of the blinding blue-white cone of light, people ran and stumbled. Their clothes grew black under the swarm as if turning to cinder. The boy behind Nyla grew hairy with drones. His mother tried beating them off, but they bounced right back or onto her instead. Nyla cried out for her friends, for her father. Where is he? Where? And felt a queer tickle on her tongue and a webby film on her teeth. She hooked her fingers inside her mouth and pulled out a dozen tiny drones. She spat, then shut her mouth tight. Everything went silent. Everyone had stopped shouting once they realized the drones would fly into their open mouths. The swarm was so thick, the air so feverish with it, that she couldn't see. She cupped a hand into a visor, and still she felt the scrape of thin legs and wings on her corneas. Finally, she wiped her eyes with her fingers and shut them too. If the drones had been sent to subdue the crowd, they had served their purpose. Everyone was still, eyes closed, mouths closed, shoulders raised, arms wrapped around their bodies. Such a quiet conquest. A dark blanket cast over the people, gently chewing into them, bites stippling across the expanse of their skin. Minutes passed, then the muffle began to loosen. The swarm rose and swung again into its measured spirals, moving slightly faster now, as if lighter. Nyla realized what this meant. The drones had not come to extract something from their bodies, but to deliver something. The virus vaccine, administered via the tiniest, plentiest injections. Mission accomplished, the drones skittered up into the cone of light. The brightness gulped them steadily and then cut to black, as if the throat of light had choked. Thank you.
Hi guys. God. I could say African Game of Thrones, but that got me in a lot of trouble. Including with George Martin. A very, very loose description of Black Leopard, Red Wolf is it's set in a kind of an imagined African landscape, which was hugely inspired by the Omo Valley, sort of lower Ethiopia, upper Kenya. And in it, a bunch of mercenaries are given the job to find a missing boy. He's been missing for 3 years. And that boy turned out to not be what anybody expected. But at the end of it, the boy is dead. Spoiler alert. And there are only 3 witnesses. And each witness who's given an account of what happened ends up narrating a separate book. So this is the first witness. His name is Tracker. One of his eyes is human, the other eyes are wolves. And he's the person who tells the first story in this volume, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and then other characters tell the other story, the same version of the same story. So I wasn't planning on doing a part 1, part 2, part 3. I basically have 3 characters telling the same damn story over and over again. So I'm going to read a section also near the end, where it's one of the few parts of the novel not told by Tracker. It's told by a griot. And he's witnessing Tracker in domestic life, and you know, it's. I think there are a lot of people in and outside of the continent who think queerness and otherness is very un-African. These people don't know shit about Africa. I remember talking to Lola Shunyin from Nigeria, and somebody asked, "Do you think Africa will ever be ready for queerness?" And Lola says, Africa was born ready until a bunch of American TV preachers told them they weren't. So this is before Rick Warren showed up. Says, I've been walking many days and many nights. When across it I come, a tree near a river, I climb up and hear the parrot and the crow and the baboon. I hear children laughing, screaming, fighting, making gods hush. And there atop lie a man on a rug. What kind of man is this? Not like any man in any village. And he said, are you looking for beauty? I said, I think I found it. And hark, the man laughed, and he said, the women of the village find me so ugly. When I take the children to the markets, they say, look at that ugly family, look at those wretched beasts. But that one, Ninkita, Ingumbu, Bamba, he have hair like a horse. But I say, beautiful, wise, bountiful woman, plump in bosom and wide in smile, I am not a zombie, I am pretty like cowling clay. And they laugh hard, they give me Doro bear and play in my hair. And I tell you, in none of these things I find any offense. And I said to this man, this tree, do you live in it? He said, there is no you, only we, and we are a strange house. Stay with us as long as you wish. When I climb through a hole and sit in a spot, I see he coming, bringing back meat. I say, who is the man so sour with the eye of a wolf? Who cursed him so? But children little, children big, children who is but air, run down the tree and stampede him, and don't care that he's cursing. His cursing would scare the owl. And they jump up on him and sit on his head and rest under his arm. And I'm thinking, these children have big feelings for this man, and the sour face gone. And the wolf eye climb up to the top and stop when he see me and keep climbing. And when he reach the top, he see the other man, and they put lips together and open their mouths. I know. The one with the wolf eye, he's the one who says, the night is getting old, why are you not sleeping? The sun is in the sky, why are you not waking? Food is ready, when are you going to eat it? Did the gods curse me and make me a mother? No, he blessed me and made you my wife, the one called Masi said. And the children laugh, and the wolf eye scowl, and scowl and scowl into a laugh. I was there, I see it. And I see it when they chase all the children out and say, go to the river now, and stay till the sun start to shift. And when they all gone, they think I gone too. For Masi says to the wolf eye own tongue, Segeye yidobo, he say, Segeye yidobo, let us love each other. For they too, they grab each other and kiss lip, then kiss tongue, then kiss neck and nipple and lower. And one was the woman and one was the man, and both was a woman and both was a man, and neither was neither. And the wolf eye, he rested his head in Masi lap. Masi, he be rubbing the wolf eye's chest. They just stay there looking at each other, eye studying eye, face at rest. Maybe they're sharing a dream. One day, wolf eye called them all together. Children, he say, come out from the river and present yourselves. And you're not raised by the jackal or the hyena. And each child present me his name, but their names I have all forgotten. This is what the wolf eye say. He say, Masi, I am Ku, and a Ku man can only be one kind of man. And Masi says, how are you not a man? What do I grab between the legs? Masi making joke, but wolf eye not making joke. He say, I've been running, I've been hiding, I've been looking for something that I don't know, but I know I'm looking for it. And I don't know, but every Ku find it. But there's blood between me and this village, and I can never go back. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I think, for all of us in this room, we have, for better or worse, been living in like the wreckage of a post-racial America, right? So I'm interested in the idea of this title of Decolonized epics. And do you think that in this moment in time that the idea of colonization or decolonization can exist in past tense? And I'm curious about how you approach like the idea of colonization in your own work, how you resist it, like the idea of colonization while like understanding how far the oppressor's hand reaches.
Okay. I'll go first. I think definitely we cannot talk about decolonized epics, the act of being decolonized in the past tense, right? It's ongoing. But hopefully if we think of novels or stories as having a sort of indefinite shelf life, it can still be decolonized epics 100 years from now, depending on whether or not, we'll have decolonized then. So in House of Stone, I was very interested in, I actually used a concept from Edward Said, which is the idea of reading or talking to each other contrapuntally, right, rather than imperially, and where he talks about metropolitan history. In this sense, it would be Western history as the center, and other histories, which would be, say, my history, Black Zimbabwean history, in the periphery, in conversation with metropolitan history. But what I did is I inverted that, and Black Zimbabwean history is the center of my novel. It is, because Black Zimbabweans, or people, do not go around thinking of themselves as peripheral. So it is the center of the history, and it's in conversation with histories from elsewhere. So in the novel, it's in conversation with Rhodesian history, with American history, because I also wrote the novel when I was in America, and it was just fascinating having those conversations. It references also some Russian history, because there was the Cold War. So, you know, that era of decolonization was also very internationalist in spirit, so that's also what I wanted to capture. So the idea for me really was to render the colonizer's gaze ineffectual within the novel, to ignore it, go around it, not talk to it, but talk around it, in conversation with it without having to confront its falsehoods. But I think what that did in the novel was create an interesting... So I've heard over and over again that Zamani is an unreliable narrator, which was interesting to me because I think at each point in time in history, Zamani is sort of retelling a novel in real time, and as new information comes up, he keeps revising things. So it seems to me at each moment when Zamani is telling a story or telling you what could be a little tidbit, a little fib, he actually believes it. He himself believes what he's saying, even as we as the readers can see that it's not true. So I thought that was sort of an interesting idea for what unreliability is and what is authoritative history. Since we know colonial history distorted so much of African history, we know post-colonial history currently distorts also a lot of history. So what do we mean when we say what being authoritative in history? So we cannot be authoritative. History, you choose, right? It's a deliberate choice of what to take from the past to serve your present and future. So that's what the novel tries to look at.
Amazing.
Yes, I think the idea of writing without the colonial or imperial or just white gaze is something that's been very popularized in the US by the thinking of Toni Morrison and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And what's interesting to me is that Morrison described her understanding of recentering her focus onto Black life without the white gaze. She learned that from African writers. She says that in interview. And Ngugi, you know, very famously in Decolonizing the Mind, made this effort. He's like, I'm going to write only in Kikuyu, which is his native language in Kenya. What's interesting is that he wrote his novels in English and then translates them into Kikuyu. So he kind of has to do both all the time. And this kind of double vision of having to always see yourself through the eyes of the oppressor, but also see yourself from the inside is something we know from Du Bois, from the idea of double consciousness. But for me, it felt like there was no way to write about my country without taking into account the colonial period. So Jennifer Makumbi's Ugandan epic, Chintu, which would have been a wonderful, actually, companion to our books up here, she does this amazing thing where she just skips the colonial period altogether. She starts with the Buganda kingdom, skips the colonial period, comes to the present day Uganda. And she can do that because there was a kingdom. Zambia never had a kingdom. So our country right now, we have 7 major tribes. We do the news in 7 languages. And these lines that were drawn around our country were extremely arbitrary. Up in the Northwest, there's a right angle. It's like the states in the US. It's like everything else is this riverine kind of thing following the natural curves of the landscape. And the reason it's a right angle is because I think it was like the British and the Germans couldn't decide, so they were like, the King of Italy, would you draw this border for us? And he just drew 2 straight lines. And that cut through people's villages. You know, my mom's village, the border was drawn right through her village. The chief had to send his sister across the border. She always joked that that's why our culture is matriarchal, is because the randomness of cutting the village in half. So for me, these arbitrary borders, this kind of colonial imposition, is something I couldn't not address because Zambia wouldn't exist without it. But what I wanted to do in my novel is to overturn our understanding of it. and kind of flip our expectations about it. So the very notion of the old drift as this settlement on a bank of a river where everyone dies because they're trying to survive in this new place was very key to my sense of the arbitrariness of how the colonial empire came. I start with a colonial kind of British figure he has a class chip on his shoulder, he's a terrible man, he's kind of a brute and a racist, and I base him on a real character, a real historical man named Percy Clarke, who wrote a biography called, an autobiography called Autobiography of an Old Drifter. And he becomes part of my novel as a way to destabilize the sense that the colonizing power had any kind of rationale, or that they were reasonable people, or that they were somehow better than the people that they were colonizing. So a lot of what I'm doing is trying to overturn the colonial gaze rather than talk around it, as Novuyo does.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought up Jennifer, because I remember years ago, I was a judge for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and Jennifer's story, Let Us Tell This Story Properly,
Yeah.
was on the list, and it was me and another writer spending, I think it was already like maybe 2 a.m. my time, and me and another writer, I was explaining to the other judges why this constitutes a short story. Because they were just so used to this kind of story of European suburban ennui. And I had to explain to them call and response. So you have to understand, this is not a language written in a remotely white gaze. You know, it was a story that deliberately stops and starts.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't like this ending, let's tell this story properly.
Yeah.
It blew my mind, and I've been a huge fan of her ever since. And the reason why I'm glad you brought her up, because for me, decolonizing meant coming to terms with English.
Yes.
Because I write in that language, and I speak well and spoke an extremely colonized English. And I think in Jamaica and a lot of in the Caribbean, we think this is proper English. And it wasn't until like I came around English people that I realized that I sound like the butler. And that was, of course, deliberate. We learned a very servile, very verbose, very kind of pompous kind of English. So, and it was a big fight for me, not even with this novel, with my second novel, The Book of Night Woman, to write it in patois. In fact, I wrote the first 70 pages in Jane Austen English. It's terrible, you'll never see it. But I fought the very characters in the book. They just like, it's so screamed to be a story told in their voices, and I fought so hard against it. And even when I came to the point of really realizing this is where the books came from, I remember before I sent it to an American publisher, I remember sending it to a British publisher who shall remain nameless, Viking. And the editor there asked me if I would consider rewriting it in standard English, otherwise it won't appeal to Britain and the rest of the world. And first, you need to stop saying the rest of the world every time you say Britain. You don't own it.
Yeah.
And two, I said, well, no wonder Huckleberry Finn is an American novel. But it's so even after overcoming that colonization of language. And what I find is, certainly with writers like myself, you either end up with a sort of a pompous, servile English, or you end up with a deliberately astringent English, which I'm not sure is that much. I don't know. It's like, it's like every now and then when I read V.S. Naipaul's Gorillas, I'm like, you need to come back to mimic men, dude. So to find that, what I had to decolonize English, I had to realize even the English don't own English.
Oh.
And this idea that British English is standard is so ludicrous. Have you heard British English? I said, what is with the over-vowelization? And you can't even put a U and an R together. It's sour, not sir. Anyway, but to realizing that nobody gets to own the language anymore, and anybody can claim it, and we can do all these things with it. And when I hear from certain people that I couldn't recognize the English, I'm like, oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Because I think but it's a process. It will always be present tense. Because it's because there's always an act of decolonization. There will always be publishers who go, can you rewrite the book in a certain way? Why does it have to be this? Could you not write it in pidgin? What does the Wolof mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, don't. And in fact, don't even translate it. Leave it.
Can I say something? Yeah. So yeah, the butler thing is funny because a British writer who will actually remain nameless told me that my writing was like a British policeman, which is a similar sort of like formal working class, whatever. And yeah, and also Achebe, said very early on, yes, we're going to write in English, but we're going to do untold things with it. But to take that ownership of English, I mean, we, as African writers, when we were in Berlin recently, we were asked, why do you write in English? Doesn't that not mean you're not really African? And my response was, English is an African language. It's spoken by like 60% of the continent. I'm like, that's probably more than the US at this point. So it's a very strange idea that, I think because decolonizing the mind was so influential, this idea that you can write in this. But like I said, Ngugi still writes in English. He just translates himself, which I think is really interesting, is that you always have to do both, which is why we have the range.
And that also that we're at, you go to Africa, you're also encountering, people from different tribes and backgrounds that have to communicate in their colonizers' tongues because that's the common language it's a common language of violence. This is one thing that everyone shares. So speaking of the epic, I think for most people encounter the idea of the epic in school, and it's often rooted in this idea of Western European traditions. We all know the Odyssey, the Iliad, Paradise Lost. But I'm curious about the idea of, what happens when the epic is taken out of that tradition. So I guess my question is, for you as writers, why did you engage with the epic? Because, traditionally epics are used to see back further than recorded history or memory. And so I think, as you guys are all saying, that one of the interesting things is that, or not interesting, is that so often because of colonization, we haven't gotten to tell our own stories, or they've been disregarded by mainstream publishing. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on what you think the epic form can do for the time we're in now, especially for African writers and writers of its diaspora, particularly in the work to reclaim narratives.
Sorry, the reclaiming part is important. I gave a speaking of British finance, I gave a Tolkien lecture earlier this year, and I was explaining the privilege of taking your myths for granted. How, for example, in the UK, Camelot, King Arthur is an essential mythology. Because it's how they'd used to reinforce the idea that civilization was always British, that British was always civilized. They were one of the most backward people in Europe. I mean, the Picts were someone had never told them yet, you don't have to use shit to build a cave. But the King Arthur myth and the chivalry and the idea of court reinforces this idea from the earliest days of Britannia. I'm not knocking it, but I understand that. But you can see how even now that kind of certitude, which is fueling things like Brexit, stems from this centuries and centuries of having that myth as a background. So when, for example, in the diaspora, a bunch of stolen, kidnapped people, and thinking that ground zero is slavery. That kind of mythological history, and a mythological history is just the emotional history of a people. Without that, then I did feel kind of headless without knowing I was. So I find myself, and I do love all the Greek epics, and I love so on, but going back to things like the Epic of Sanjara, which you people call the Lion King, it's not based on Hamlet. Cut that bullshit. Or the Epic of Askia Muhammad, or the Epic of people like Sonny Albert and so on. Kudos to people who don't need those, but I needed them because I wanted to. One of the reasons why I knew this had to be a fantasy novel is that I wanted to do what Tolkien did with the Caligula or the Mamignomian, and all these things. And it's like, you know, every rock and roll artist eventually comes back to the blues, well, the good ones. And I think that, you know, for me, that epic form, before there are distinctions between prose and poetry or prose and song, I know I had to go tap back into that, even though I was writing something imaginary.
So Zamani in the novel, he's an anti-hero, right? So it's like a satire of the epic. And it was interesting, I learned after House of Stone was published that it's actually Zimbabwe's first epic written in English, which is weird. As in the first novel that takes that scope of history, which is, it also looks at pre-colonial history. But why I wanted that scope, first just thematically, was to make sure that I link the periods, because as I was reading up about history, it was so fascinating reading and seeing possible cause and effect. And then you read a lot of African fiction where we have traumatic history is usually read as ahistorical, like, oh, there was a genocide, you know, the blacks are at it again. And I feel like white Western media loves this. They conveniently will eschew anything that came before as if this rose out of a vacuum. So for me, I was interested in these connections between pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. Once that was out of the way, just in terms of aesthetics, the colonial sort of, the epic, which is the sort of elongated range, was fun to play with because the prose gets to play. So Zamani is, you know, he's playful, then he can be serious, then he's sermonic. There's a part where he parodies Shakespeare. He just keeps parodying people. There's a part where he parodies Alice Walker. There's a part where he parodies a Ndebele writer called Barbara Makalisa. So I took the epic also to be not just about themes, but literary. So it also makes literary allusions in a way that cannot be placed. Because again, a question for me for the novel was, what is Zimbabwe, right? And we have to think outside of the borders that Namwali was talking about, and language that Marlon was talking about. So for me also, it was a way of also just subverting any one reading of Zimbabwe and any understanding of my being a black African means. I'm reclaiming just a pre-colonial history. I'm Ndebele, so it's a Ndebele history. And that is important, but I think it's been done. So I think also what I'm trying to do is to build off from the Achebe generation, the Ngugi generation. They did that. They wrote back to Conrad. In the 21st century, I'm more ambivalent, right? I'm more like, I'm claiming the world. As an individual, I want to try and dip into every little pot, probably greedy, as a subject of the world and build my own little castle. And I will be honest and say, I read a lot. I come from I wasn't trained formally in English, but our libraries are full of European, especially European and American fiction. So my models were Rushdie's Midnight's Children, and then this great book, The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. Has anyone? I was sad when I went to Germany. The Germans didn't, you know, like Günter Grass, you know, you're a writer. No, you know, so maybe he's dying out, which is sad. But that's a brilliant book. So there's Oscar is a dwarf, the anti-hero. So actually, I really wanted to do with Zim history what he did with German history, which is subversive on the historical level, the language level. I'm told even the German version of that book is subversive, and then subversive on the historical level, right? Who gets to say what my history is? And so that was sort of, and then of course an aversion from heroes, because Zimbabwe is built right now oppressively on heroes. We have male heroes and everyone else, and this is, you know, everyone else is not a hero, so you don't get a say in the country. So Zamani deliberately is an anti-hero. It's a book full of traitors, men who fled the war, men who fought on the wrong side, then reclaimed the history, women who tried to fight in the war but ended up in villages they didn't expect, right? So it's sort of tries to reclaim that sort of narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would just agree with what everyone has said, because it's very, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, but I would say that there's a great moment in your book where there's like a hero is supposed to have this and this and this, but I don't really feel like doing that. And I love that kind of like dismissal and this idea of an anti-hero. And at least for me, and I know that there's references to Tutuola in your book and Okri in your book. So the post-colonial epic is kind of like it's like we are post-colonial epics in a sense. We're not
Yeah.
really writing back to the originals.
Yeah.
You know, in some ways we are. I mean, I'm embracing the originals because I have this Greek chorus. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and if you're going back to thinking about Tolkien, it's like the people that we are writing to are the people who already changed the form. So for me, Marquez, Rushdie, the post-colonial epic, and so the only thing I'll contribute to the ways that we're trying to pervert the epic is through, we're also doing that a lot through form, not just through our characters, not just through what kind of history we're telling, but also we are playing with fantasy, futurism, the Dostoevskian novel, right? The novel of ideas, right? And we're flipping those kinds of epic characteristics as well at a very linguistic level.
I mean, in that vein, it makes me wonder, like, in what ways can we use the epic to look into the future and, like, discover a future for Africa and Jamaica and all, and for, like, all writers, Black writers who are writing from, like, the diaspora?
Well, I think the great thing about the epic or so on, or the I guess the big novel, because we all wrote such big novels, is that but it's also claiming a big canvas.
Yeah.
It's I think we all realize the type of stories we tell, one person couldn't tell it, or one story couldn't tell it, or one form couldn't tell it. And I'm glad you brought up Gunter Grass and so on, because I don't want to say I didn't read all these great Greek dramas and yes, I went through Homer again and all of that. But so what Namwali was saying, I think the really key thing there is play.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's these are all the tools that are at your disposal, and they're tools. I know, again, coming from my background, I always approach English like I was a servant of it. And I always approach it like, these are the tools, these are the ways in which you must bow down and respect it. And now I'm like, nah, man, smack it, flip it, rub it down, who cares? It's like... because I think I'm trying to the turning point was actually a documentary, and Maya Angelou was on it, and she said Maya Angelou said words are something that you can grab, roll into a ball, throw it against a wall, and watch it bounce. I'm like, what? I thought words are things you get hit on the knuckles for when they didn't spell them right. The idea that is so much power, and the idea that the natural rhythm, because I think one of the things I brought up Nepal earlier, and this kind of astringent English, one of the things that I thought was interesting, if you again look at Mimic Men as opposed to Guerrillas, is when he deliberately killed his own lyricism, which to me is the saddest thing. It's like, it's because I know I grew up thinking it's a kind of inferiority, the kind of, where you going with that sing-songy English. And funny enough, reading things like Midnight's Children, when he just sort of threw that in, I'm like, oh wow! It just, the idea that all the tools you have to make a good sentence you already have. It's a tool. It's what you use with your friends. Just never occurred to me. And then to dare, I think, to do that on a tale that doesn't end in, say, 50 pages, although there's absolutely nothing wrong with a tale that ends in that way, because there are epics out there that are 120 pages long. It's the ambition and the idea that there is no should when you're telling a story.
Yes, like you can be irresponsible.
Yeah.
That's something
Yeah.
that struck me a lot. A lot of people are like, well, you're giving people like a really weird impression of your country. You have like women who cry for decades, and women with hair growing out of their body for decades, or like perpetually.
I'm welcoming the mosquito drones, though.
And mosquito
I'm just saying.
drones and mosquito, and I'm like, I didn't write a tour guide to Zambia. I didn't do, it's like, when I say the great Zambian novel, I'm like, there's scare quotes around it. It's a joke, but there's a sense that, our precursors, our ancestors, God bless them, really did have to be responsible. They had to write back.
Yeah.
They had to reject the idea that our language was broken and flowery.
Yeah.
And so they had to do that. Or if they embraced that, they had to do it in the mode of exoticizing themselves,
Yeah, it's like
right?
writing inside a respectability politics.
Yeah, and now we can just play, and I love that.
Yeah, because otherwise then you have a novelist like Bessie Head who did all those things and then paid the price for it. where, I mean, thank God Toni Morrison mentioned her, because that was the first time some people heard who Bessie Head is. Yeah.
Yeah, she's incredible.
We have to wrap up soon, so I want to make sure, Novuyo, do you have anything you want to add to that?
About the future.
Yeah.
Future
Oh,
and the-
we didn't even talk about the future.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
That little question, the future.
No, the future. The future. Your novel is actually more futuristic than mine. So you should, but my novel was just more like a question. It's like a question mark for Zimbabwe rather than answers. But the language. When you talk about language and trying to break it, is interesting. So one thing I didn't really insist on it so much as it just didn't happen was my publishers did not italize vernacular when writing. And then my editors didn't italize, but I think it's also because there's like French slipped in there. There's Ndebele, right? There's Shona, then there's like African American slang. So I guess it was also just I wondered the idea of just language sitting next to each other, right? And I know it's threw some readers off, but then the case of language, and then the case of story, then the case of where you publish. Just one sort of interesting thing I had, America, the great America. I had one editor suggest helpfully, because Americans would not get the novel, because Americans are Americans, and had suggested that I have an American narrator in the novel, who Zamani is now telling the history of Zimbabwe to an American. And of course, in my mind, I was like, so will it be a white American? Is that what like when we now do, who are we going to be talking to? And besides, it sort of also subverts the idea. So I mean, the idea of publishing in the diaspora also becomes interesting if you are writing about Africa, because of all these anxieties and questions and craft things that you're forced. I was forced because I didn't know that this is how the industry works when I got here. And at some point I was so frustrated with the American reader, who was apparently central to my book when I was talking to my Black Zimbabwean readers, that I had a note at the beginning of the novel to the American reader. I spent my entire life reading your fiction, now it is your turn to pick it. But they removed it. So.
Yeah.
But I do love that what you said, that your epic is a question, and I think that that right there is almost the answer to the future for what the epic can do for to look into the future, is that it can become a question in which whiteness isn't the answer. And I think we'll have to end there. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions because I was told that we need to get out of this room. So again, I'm going to take the authors with me to the table. So again, please buy the authors' books. Writers have bills too, and I'm going to walk them to the book table, and they'll see you there. Thank you for coming.